Hey guys, tonight we begin with a fire that has already gone out. Not a dramatic fire, not the kind that brings down kingdoms in a single night, while trumpets blare and historians start rubbing their hands together. This one is quieter, a fire that leaves only a few orange embers in a stone hearth, a faint smell of smoke in a room, and the soft ticking of rain against old glass. So if you are in bed, this is your official invitation to get comfortable. Dim the lights. Put your phone face down if you can. Let the room grow a little darker. Imagine a long medieval corridor somewhere far from modern traffic. Imagine wet cobblestones outside. Imagine servants moving quietly in the distance, carrying candles that flicker whenever a draft slips beneath the door. And imagine a king who cannot sleep. Because tonight is not really about battles. It is not about who conquered whom or who planted a flag on which hill. Tonight is about the strange private evenings of the powerful, the hours after the banquets, the moments when crowns become heavy, wigs become itchy, and royal people discover that having absolute authority over millions of subjects is not actually the same thing as having a peaceful mind. We begin in the late 17th century, in a palace that is all polished mirrors and damp stone. Outside, rain taps steadily on the windows. Inside, a small fire glows low. The king sits alone, staring at it with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years being told he is the center of the universe, and has recently begun to suspect that the universe may not be listening. His name is Charles II. And unfortunately for him, he is one of history's greatest examples of what happens when royal families treat marriage less like a human relationship and more like a very exclusive neighborhood club where everyone is somehow related to everyone else. Now, to be fair, dynastic marriage was not considered weird at the time. European royal houses spent centuries marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and various combinations that today would cause a modern family tree app to display a warning message and perhaps quietly suggest a different hobby. The goal was simple: keep power concentrated, keep territory connected, keep outsiders away from the inheritance. Because why invite new people into the dynasty when you can simply continue recycling the existing relatives? A strategy that sounded excellent on parchment and considerably less excellent in the genetic department. Charles inherited the accumulated consequences of this policy. By the time he was born in 1661, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family had been marrying close relatives for generations. Historians who have traced the family tree often describe it with the exhausted tone of people who eventually realized they were drawing a circle. Charles's famous jaw was not merely a strong chin. It was a result of repeated inbreeding across centuries. His lower jaw protruded so dramatically that he struggled to chew food properly. He spoke with difficulty. He suffered from chronic illnesses throughout his life. He was physically frail, frequently exhausted, and surrounded by doctors who prescribed treatments that ranged from ineffective to creatively alarming. And yet he was also, officially, the ruler of one of the largest empires on earth. This is one of those historical contrasts that feels almost designed for sleepy contemplation. Somewhere in Madrid, officials were discussing colonies across oceans while their king was struggling to eat dinner. The palace physicians hovered around him endlessly. They argued over bloodletting schedules. They debated the proper balance of hot and cold humors. They recommended strange tonics involving herbs, minerals, and occasionally substances that should probably have remained in the ground. None of it helped very much. Charles grew increasingly withdrawn. He spent long hours in private apartments, often near the fire, listening to the weather. Courtiers described him as melancholy and deeply religious. He became obsessed with signs, omens, and the possibility that supernatural forces were influencing his health. To be honest, If a team of doctors had spent decades bleeding me, feeding me questionable remedies, and repeatedly informing me that my body was mysteriously failing, I might also begin suspecting supernatural forces. Rainy evenings became particularly difficult. The palace windows of 17th century Madrid were not the perfectly insulated glass panels we know today. Wind slipped through the frames. Candle flames trembled. Water traced uneven lines down the panes, turning the outside world into a blurry watercolor. Charles would sit near the hearth wrapped in heavy fabric, watching the reflections of flames in the window. Behind him stretched rooms filled with expensive furniture, tapestries, silver objects, and all the material evidence of royal magnificence. In front of him was rain. And the strange thing is that the rain did not care. That is one of the quiet themes that runs through many royal lives. Monarchs could command armies, appoint ministers, and collect taxes from millions of people. But they could not order the weather to stop. They could not command their bodies to become healthy. They could not guarantee themselves a calm night of sleep. The embers burned lower. Servants entered softly to add more wood. Charles often barely acknowledged them. Court etiquette required elaborate rituals for almost every interaction with the king, which meant that even placing a log on the fire involved a choreography of bows, gestures, and careful retreating. Imagine needing a ceremonial procedure every time someone refills your fireplace. Absolute monarchy was, among other things, astonishingly inconvenient. As the reign continued, Charles sometimes requested music. Not lively music, nothing suitable for dancing. He preferred slow, sacred pieces performed quietly in adjoining rooms. The sound would drift through the corridors, muted by stone walls and heavy curtains, creating an atmosphere that visitors described as eerily subdued. It is easy to picture the scene. A nearly extinguished fire, wet glass reflecting candlelight, a sickly king listening to distant voices, an empire waiting outside the door, and somewhere beyond the palace, ordinary people in Madrid were likely doing exactly what people do during rainstorms in every century: closing shutters, warming soup, complaining about damp shoes, trying to keep children from tracking mud across the floor. History often feels less distant when we remember that the weather was shared. Charles eventually married twice, though neither marriage produced children. This became the central political problem of his reign. Every European court watched anxiously, calculating what would happen when the last Spanish Habsburg died without an heir. Diplomats wrote letters filled with coded language. Ministers held secret discussions. Foreign rulers positioned themselves like chess players preparing for the endgame. Meanwhile, Charles remained trapped in his own body, increasingly aware that he was expected to continue a dynasty that had already exhausted itself. On some evenings, he reportedly asked to see portraits of his ancestors. The walls of the palace were filled with Habsburg faces, stern men with prominent jaws, richly dressed women with pale complexions, generations of rulers who had spent centuries consolidating power through marriage alliances. Looking at them must have been a peculiar experience. He could see the family resemblance everywhere, the same facial features repeated again and again, as though the dynasty had become a painter repeatedly tracing the same sketch. A court observer later remarked that Charles seemed to study these portraits not with pride, but with something closer to resignation. And here, by the fading fire, we encounter one of those gently tragic historical moments that never appears in school textbooks. Not a treaty, not a battle. Simply a tired man looking at paintings of relatives who had all contributed, in one way or another, to the condition that was slowly destroying him. The rain softened. The palace grew quieter. Somewhere a clock marked the hour. Charles remained awake. Let's drift for a moment away from Madrid and float northward to the damp evening air to another palace, another fire, and another royal figure who discovered that luxury is perfectly compatible with profound unhappiness. This time we arrive in Versailles, during the reign of Louis XIV. Now, Louis is often remembered as the Sun King, the ultimate symbol of royal grandeur. He built enormous gardens, hosted spectacular ceremonies, and generally behaved as though the universe had been designed as a stage for his personal performance, which, to be fair, was an effective political strategy. But even the Sun King had evenings. Versailles during rainstorms was surprisingly melancholy. The famous gardens became sheets of wet gravel and dripping hedges. Fountains fell silent. Courtiers who normally wandered the grounds retreated indoors, where hundreds of candles struggled against the gray light filtering through the windows. Louis hated being alone. This is a detail that feels wonderfully human. The man who projected supreme confidence often arranged his daily life so that he was almost never without an audience. He woke in public, dressed in public, ate in public, and went to bed according to an elaborate ritual involving nobles competing for the privilege of handing him items of clothing. It was essentially celebrity culture combined with feudal hierarchy. Yet on rainy evenings after the ceremonies ended, even Versailles could feel empty. Louis would sometimes pace to the Hall of Mirrors, where candlelight multiplied endlessly in the glass. Rain streaked the tall windows. Reflections shifted with every movement. The effect was beautiful, but also slightly unreal, as though the palace were dissolving into fragments of light. He was aging by then. Friends had died. Mistresses had come and gone. The dazzling court that once seemed immortal was gradually changing around him. Younger nobles whispered about succession. Ministers worried about finances. Wars had become expensive, and the mirrors reflected all of it. A contemporary wrote that the king occasionally stopped before the windows during storms and stood silently for several minutes, watching the rain run down the glass. It is tempting to imagine him thinking profound philosophical thoughts about mortality and power. More likely he was simply tired. History's great rulers are often presented as symbols rather than people. But symbols do not develop aching joints. Symbols do not lose friends. Symbols do not stare out windows while listening to bad weather. People do. Louis eventually became increasingly religious and withdrawn in his later years. The extravagant energy of his youth faded into something calmer, almost subdued. The palace remained magnificent, but its master no longer moved through it with the effortless confidence of earlier decades. One rainy evening, according to court memoirs, he remarked quietly that all glory resembles smoke. A surprisingly reflective comment from a man who had spent much of his life commissioning statues of himself dressed as a Roman god. The embers in Versailles glowed softly. The mirrors darkened as candles burned down. And somewhere hundreds of courtiers continued performing the endless dance of royal life, bowing, waiting, watching, hoping to remain visible in a world where visibility meant survival. That is another strange aspect of palace existence. Imagine living in a building filled with thousands of people and still feeling lonely. Versailles was crowded almost constantly. Nobles slept in cramped apartments. Servants hurried through corridors. Guards stood at their posts. Musicians rehearsed. Cooks prepared enormous meals. The palace was less a residence than a small city organized around a single individual. Yet the closer one approached the king, the more isolated he often became. Conversations were formal. Friendships were complicated by ambition. Every gesture carried political meaning. Even casual remarks could become court gossip within hours. Under those conditions, a rainy evening by the fire may have been one of the few moments when Louis could simply exist without performing kingship quite so intensely. The rain continued across Europe. In Madrid, Charles listened to distant music. In Versailles, Louis watched water slide down mirrored windows. 2 monarchs, 2 palaces, 2 fires slowly collapsing into ash. And beyond both palaces stretched a continent of ordinary houses where people were probably already asleep. That contrast is worth holding on to as we let the night deepen around us. Because history is not only the story of crowns and treaties, it is also the story of tired human beings sitting beside fading embers while rain taps softly against glass. The rain never really stopped. It simply changed its rhythm. Sometimes it fell in long, patient curtains across palace roofs. Sometimes it arrived as a gentle tapping against tiny panes of uneven glass. And sometimes it became little more than a damp mist that wrapped castles in silence, making every tower seem farther away than it really was. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. If you're already drifting somewhere between history and sleep, even better. Let's simply continue walking through these quiet halls together. The embers in Charles II fireplace had settled into a warm orange glow. A servant quietly placed another log onto the fire, bowed almost to the floor, and disappeared without making enough noise to disturb the king's thoughts. Life inside a royal palace was strangely quiet. That might sound surprising. After all, thousands of people lived and worked inside these enormous buildings. Servants polished silver. Clerks copied letters. Guards marched endless patrols. Cooks argued over sauces that would be forgotten by breakfast. Yet somehow, beneath all that activity, there was an overwhelming silence. Everyone whispered. Everyone waited. Everyone listened for footsteps. Because in a palace, footsteps mattered. Heavy footsteps might belong to a minister carrying unpleasant news. Quick footsteps might belong to a physician. Slow footsteps often meant an elderly noble who had absolutely nowhere urgent to be, but intended to look important anyway. Court life had a remarkable ability to transform ordinary walking into political theater. Charles listened to those footsteps every evening. His hearing, unlike much of his health, remained remarkably sharp. Sometimes he could identify visitors simply from the rhythm of their shoes against polished stone. Ministers walked differently from priests. Old servants moved differently from ambitious young courtiers trying very hard to appear confident. After decades inside the Alcazar of Madrid, the palace had become less of a building and more of a familiar collection of sounds. Crackling wood, rustling silk, soft rain, distant church bells, and occasionally the low murmur of physicians disagreeing with one another. The doctors never truly agreed on anything. One believed the king needed more rest. Another insisted he needed more exercise. A third blamed the weather, which, to be fair, has remained one of humanity's favorite explanations for mysterious ailments ever since. Charles accepted their advice with quiet patience. There was little else he could do. His mornings began slowly, very slowly. Getting dressed could take nearly an hour, not because the clothing itself was especially complicated. Although 17th century royal fashion certainly tried its best, but because every movement required assistance. Heavy embroidered coats, layer after layer of linen, velvet, lace, jewels. The crown itself was almost the easiest part. Imagine already feeling exhausted before breakfast simply because your wardrobe weighed nearly as much as modern camping equipment. Royal elegance demanded sacrifices, mostly from the person wearing it. Breakfast rarely offered much comfort. Charles struggled to chew. His famous Habsburg jaw made eating difficult throughout his life. Meals that other monarchs devoured with enthusiasm became slow. Careful exercises and patience. Courtiers politely looked away. No one mentioned the obvious. Palace etiquette had countless rules, but perhaps its greatest talent was pretending uncomfortable realities did not exist. If the king was ill, Everyone spoke of temporary weakness. If the treasury was empty, it became financial adjustment. If the royal family had married cousins for 200 years, well, that topic somehow never appeared during dinner conversation. History can be wonderfully committed to avoiding awkward subjects. Outside, rain continued washing the palace roofs. Inside, letters arrived from every corner of Europe. France wanted something. Austria wanted something. England wanted something. The Pope wanted several things. Diplomats seemed to believe that every question required 12 pages of beautifully handwritten Latin before anyone could begin discussing it. One almost admires their commitment. Today, an email saying, "Can we talk?" creates anxiety. Back then, it required a horse. 3 weeks of travel, expensive parchment, and handwriting elegant enough to make modern calligraphy enthusiasts quietly retire. Charles read as many letters as his strength allowed. Often someone else read aloud. His eyes tired easily. His concentration wandered. Sometimes he interrupted simply to ask whether the rain had stopped. It usually had not. Far away, beyond Spain, another palace was also wrapped in rain. Vienna, the Habsburgs again. Because once a family becomes sufficiently determined to marry itself repeatedly, it tends to appear everywhere in European history. This time our attention settles upon Emperor Leopold I. Leopold looked remarkably like several of his relatives. The famous Habsburg jaw remained very much a family tradition, although tradition might be giving genetics a little too much credit. Portrait painters worked heroically. There is no other word for it. Their task was to produce flattering royal portraits while remaining vaguely recognizable. Some succeeded better than others. One painter cleverly emphasized elaborate wigs. Another focused on magnificent clothing. Another apparently decided that enough velvet could distract viewers from almost anything. Artists have always possessed remarkable diplomatic skills. Leopold himself cared far more about music than appearance. He loved composing. He loved opera. He loved quiet evenings spent listening to musicians perform inside candlelit chambers while rain drummed softly against palace windows. In another life, he might have become a respectable composer. Instead, he inherited an empire. History has an amusing habit of assigning people jobs they never would have chosen. Imagine studying music only to discover that your actual career involves negotiating wars, managing nobles, balancing impossible budgets, and occasionally pretending your cousin's latest marriage proposal is politically reasonable. Because why not double down? Leopold spent countless evenings surrounded by manuscripts. Not military maps, musical scores. He carefully adjusted melodies while servants trimmed candles nearby. Outside, the rain blurred Vienna into soft shadows. Inside, violins quietly filled enormous rooms designed more for ceremony than comfort. Music became his escape. Not triumphant marches, not energetic dances. Gentle, sacred compositions. Slow harmonies, voices floating upward beneath painted ceilings. Perhaps that is why visitors often describe the emperor as thoughtful rather than dazzling. He lacked the theatrical confidence of Louis XIV. He lacked the tragic fragility of Charles II. Instead, he possessed something quieter. The personality of a man perfectly content spending an evening discussing counterpoint, while Europe expected him to solve international politics before breakfast. There are certainly worse hobbies for an emperor. Rain creates peculiar moods inside palaces. Firelight reflects differently. Portraits seem almost alive. Long corridors stretch endlessly into darkness. Candles flicker beneath invisible drafts. Even conversations slow down. Servants lower their voices. Doors close more gently. The entire building seems to breathe more softly. Imagine walking through one of those corridors. stone beneath your feet, warm wax filling the air, rain tapping overhead. Your only light comes from a single candle. The walls are covered with portraits of kings and queens whose expressions suggest they have collectively agreed not to smile until sometime around the 19th century. It is peaceful, a little lonely, almost timeless. This was the nightly world inhabited by Europe's ruling families. Not endless celebrations, not constant excitement, mostly routines. Very expensive routines. Morning audiences, official letters, formal meals, religious services, evening conversations, sleep, repeat. Royal life often resembled a beautifully decorated office job with dramatically better furniture. Let's gently drift toward another palace, another rainy evening, another ruler discovering that crowns provide surprisingly little protection against ordinary human worries. This time we arrive in England. The fireplaces burn brighter here. The air smells faintly of damp oak. Rain runs across leaded windows overlooking dark gardens where no one has ventured for hours. Queen sits beside a table covered in correspondence. She has already lost more children than anyone should ever lose. History remembers statistics. 17 pregnancies. Very few surviving children. None reaching adulthood. Numbers become strangely cold on paper. But evenings like this remind us they represented real lives. Tiny shoes carefully stored away. Empty rooms. Silent nurseries. And often found comfort in simple routines. Reading scripture. Talking quietly with trusted companions. Watching fires slowly settle into glowing embers. Outside the palace, London continued growing into one of Europe's busiest cities. Inside, grief lingered quietly beneath royal ceremony. Visitors frequently commented on Anne's kindness. Unlike some monarchs, she did not enjoy elaborate displays of superiority. She preferred familiar faces, comfortable conversation, predictable evenings. There is something unexpectedly comforting about discovering that history's most powerful people sometimes wanted exactly what everyone else wanted. Warm rooms, good company, peace, perhaps another log on the fire. Rain continued falling beyond the windows. The palace clock struck another hour. Servants replaced burned candles with fresh ones. Life moved gently forward, always forward. Across Europe, generations came and went. Kings aged. Queens grew tired. Princes practiced ceremonies they hoped one day to perform correctly. Princesses learned languages, etiquette, music, embroidery, and the complicated art of appearing graceful while wearing dresses heavy enough to qualify as architectural structures. Children laughed in palace gardens whenever the weather allowed. Old nobles remembered better days, whether those days had actually been better or not. Human nature, fortunately, changes very little. Every generation believes a previous generation handled everything more sensibly. The previous generation usually believed exactly the same thing. History quietly smiles and continues anyway. The rain outside has become lighter now. The fire burns lower. Somewhere deep within another palace, a musician is still practicing a slow melody. Somewhere else, a tired king stares into glowing embers while wondering whether tomorrow will finally bring better news. It probably won't, but tomorrow will come all the same. Morning arrived quietly, not with bright sunshine, not with birds singing cheerfully outside every window, as paintings often suggest. Instead, the day slipped into the palace beneath heavy gray clouds. Rain still drifted across rooftops, turning every courtyard into a mirror of wet stone. Somewhere, a bell announced the hour, its sound softened by damp air. If you're listening from bed, perhaps the rain outside your own window sounds a little similar. History has a comforting habit of reminding us that people centuries ago also listened to storms while waiting for another ordinary day to begin. Inside the palace, servants had already been awake for hours. Someone swept ashes from yesterday's fireplaces. Someone polished silver that would be admired for exactly 5 minutes before fingerprints inevitably appeared again. Someone carefully opened shutters, allowing pale morning light to creep into long corridors lined with portraits of ancestors who looked permanently unimpressed. Royal life required astonishing amounts of maintenance. A king might wear a magnificent embroidered coat for a single audience. Dozens of people had likely spent weeks making it. One servant brushed the velvet, another stitched the cuffs, another carried it from room to room, another carefully folded it away afterward. Entire careers existed simply because one monarch preferred a particular shade of blue silk. Human civilization can be wonderfully complicated. Charles II, however, paid little attention to such things. His mornings had become slower with every passing year. The physicians arrived shortly after sunrise. They checked his pulse. They discussed his appetite. They nodded thoughtfully, as though they had just uncovered profound medical mystery, rather than observing the same symptoms they had discussed yesterday. Medicine in the 17th century relied heavily on confidence. Results were somewhat optional. One doctor recommended herbal mixtures. Another preferred warm baths. A third insisted that fresh country air would strengthen the king. An interesting suggestion for a ruler who could barely travel comfortably. Charles listened politely. He thanked each physician. Then he settled beside a window and watched raindrops race each other down the glass. Sometimes the simplest entertainment is surprisingly timeless. Even today, people occasionally watch rain sliding across windows without any particular reason. The difference is that Charles happened to be King of Spain while doing it. Beyond the palace walls, carts rolled through muddy streets. Merchants opened their shops. Church bells echoed across Madrid. Life continued with remarkable determination. Empires often appear permanent when viewed through history books. Living inside one felt much more ordinary. Taxes still needed collecting. Roads still needed repairing. Letters still arrived late. Officials still argued over paperwork. Some things truly never change. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, another royal household was beginning its own quiet morning. This time, we find ourselves in Vienna once more. Emperor Leopold I had already attended morning prayers. Religion shaped nearly every hour of royal life. Church services were not optional. Faith offered structure, routine, comfort, especially during uncertain times. Leopold lingered inside the chapel after most attendants had quietly departed. Candles flickered beneath painted ceilings. The scent of melted wax mixed with incense. Rain tapped softly against high windows. He remained there longer than protocol required, not because anyone expected it, simply because the silence felt pleasant. Modern visitors often imagine royal lives as endless celebrations. The reality was rather different. Ceremony occupied much of the day. Waiting occupied even more. Kings waited for ambassadors. Ambassadors waited for kings. Courtiers waited for invitations. Everyone waited for someone else to make the first move. Palaces were in many ways beautifully decorated waiting rooms. Leopold understood patience. Music had taught him that a melody could not be hurried. Neither, unfortunately, could diplomacy. When ministers finally joined him later that morning, they carried maps, reports, and the usual collection of complicated problems that somehow required immediate solutions despite having developed over several decades. Borders, treaties, money, Always money. Empires have enormous appetites. Unfortunately, they also have enormous expenses. Leopold listened carefully. He rarely interrupted. Unlike Louis XIV, who often dominated conversations with theatrical confidence, Leopold preferred thoughtful pauses. Silence can be surprisingly powerful, especially when everyone else in the room feels obligated to fill it. Now, let us gently wander toward another castle, another family, another branch of Europe's endlessly interconnected royal tree. Today we arrive in Copenhagen. The Danish court possessed a quieter elegance, less extravagant than Versailles, less imposing than Madrid, but no less devoted to ceremony. King Christian V stood beside a fireplace, reading reports from provincial governors. Rain drummed softly against the roof. A hunting trip had been canceled. No one seemed particularly disappointed. Royal hunting often required waking before sunrise, riding through cold forests, and pretending to enjoy weather that ordinary people wisely avoided. Court painters usually captured only the triumphant return, not the muddy boots, not the frozen fingers. History occasionally edits for dramatic effect. Christian folded another report. Taxes, harvests, shipbuilding. Life as a monarch involved an endless parade of practical concerns. Very few kings woke each morning thinking, I wonder whether today will become a famous chapter in future history books. Most were simply hoping the treasury remained functional until dinner. Rain has a curious effect on memory. Perhaps you've noticed that. Storms encourage reflection. They soften busy thoughts. The same was true centuries ago. Royal diaries often mention whether alongside private emotions, cloudy mornings, cold evenings, unexpected sunshine after difficult conversations. The weather became a quiet companion to daily life. Queen Anne of England frequently noted rainy afternoons in her correspondence, not because rain itself mattered politically, because it shaped how days felt. One rainy afternoon, she wrote letters to friends rather than holding elaborate gatherings. Another day, she remained indoors with books and embroidery. Small choices, entirely human choices. History becomes gentler when viewed this way. Instead of marble statues issuing commands, we find ordinary people trying to stay warm while storms passed overhead. Let us return briefly to Charles. Evening approached once more. The palace gradually settled into familiar rhythms. Candles replaced daylight. Servants closed heavy curtains. Fireplaces came alive throughout hundreds of rooms. The smell of burning oak drifted through long galleries. Charles preferred the smaller sitting room overlooking an inner courtyard. It felt quieter there, less ceremonial, almost private. Almost. Privacy scarcely existed inside royal palaces. Someone was always nearby, a guard outside the door, a servant waiting silently, an advisor hoping for a conversation. Even solitude required witnesses. Imagine never truly being alone. It sounds glamorous for perhaps 5 minutes, then merely exhausting. Charles rested beneath a heavy wool blanket. Despite the warmth of the fire, his health continued declining. Walking required greater effort. Speaking became slower. Meals grew shorter. Yet he remained remarkably gentle with those around him. Several attendants later remembered his kindness more vividly than his authority. That is a fascinating legacy. Empires disappear. Borders shift. Palaces burn. But people still remembered that their king thanked servants. Sometimes history survives through surprisingly small gestures. The rain outside intensified again. Drops struck the glass with steady determination. Firelight reflected in the window, making the room seem twice as large. Charles watched those reflections quietly. Perhaps he thought about his ancestors. perhaps about Spain, perhaps about nothing at all. Sometimes a tired person simply watches a fire. Not every silent moment requires deep philosophical meaning. Across Europe, countless other palace windows glowed softly against the darkness. Louis XIV finished another formal supper beneath glittering chandeliers. Leopold reviewed a new musical composition before retiring. Queen, and exchanged quiet conversation with trusted companions. Christian V planned tomorrow's council meeting. Different kingdoms, different languages, remarkably similar evenings. Rain, candles, letters waiting to be answered, the comforting crackle of fireplaces, and beneath layers of silk, velvet, jewels, and ceremony, ordinary human beings carrying familiar worries. The weight of family, the uncertainty of health, the passage of time. Perhaps that is why these quiet evenings endure in memory more than grand victories. Battles belong to nations. Rainy nights belong to everyone. The fire slowly settled into glowing embers once again. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken, not ending completely, just softening enough that the steady rhythm became a whisper instead of a drumbeat. It was the sort of sound that invited long thoughts. And, for many listeners, perhaps the beginning of sleep. The rain had almost disappeared. Not completely. Just enough remained to leave a soft mist hanging over palace gardens, where trimmed hedges glistened beneath the fading light. Water clung to the statues. Tiny droplets rested on rose leaves. The gravel paths looked darker than they had that morning, as though the entire garden had decided to whisper instead of speak. If you're still listening, welcome back. Tonight, we aren't rushing anywhere. History has waited hundreds of years. It can wait another quiet evening. Inside Versailles, servants moved with practiced precision. Hundreds of candles were being lit one by one, until enormous galleries slowly filled with warm golden light. There was something almost magical about candlelight inside a palace. During the daytime, enormous rooms could feel intimidating. At night, they became strangely gentle. Corners disappeared into shadow. Paintings softened. Even marble statues seemed less interested in judging everyone. Louis XIV had spent decades ensuring Versailles became the center of European fashion, politics, etiquette, and, if possible, the entire known universe. Naturally, he believed France deserved nothing less. And, to his credit, many people agreed. Or at least they agreed loudly whenever he was nearby. Being surrounded by flattering opinions was practically part of the royal furniture. Yet even the Sun King could not prevent time from doing what time always does. His famous black hair had long since turned gray beneath carefully arranged wigs. His movements slowed. The endless ceremonies that once energized him now required more effort. Every morning still followed the familiar ritual. Courtiers gathered. Doors opened. The king awoke before an audience. Imagine needing spectators before you've even had breakfast. Modern celebrities might find that slightly exhausting. Louis simply called it Tuesday. His physician entered with remarkable confidence. Doctors serving kings rarely admitted uncertainty. Instead, they spoke in calm voices while prescribing treatments that occasionally sounded suspiciously like educated guesses wrapped in expensive Latin. Fresh broth, moderate exercise, less rich food, more prayer, perhaps another herbal tonic. Medicine has certainly traveled a fascinating road. Fortunately, so has science. Louis accepted the advice politely. Whether he followed it was another matter entirely. Kings have historically been selective listeners. Outside his chamber, ministers already waited. Finance, military reports, diplomatic correspondence, trade, taxation, Everything demanded attention. Everything seemed urgent. The remarkable thing about ruling a kingdom is that someone always believes their particular problem deserves immediate discussion. Often they were right. Unfortunately, everyone else believed exactly the same thing. Across the English Channel, Queen and experienced a much quieter court. She had little interest in endless displays of grandeur. Comfort mattered more. Trusted friends mattered even more. Her favorite evenings rarely involved grand celebrations. Instead, she enjoyed reading, gentle conversation, embroidery, or simply sitting beside a fire while rain tapped softly against the windows. One can hardly blame her. There is something deeply comforting about warm firelight after a cold, damp day. Anne's life had been marked by heartbreaking loss. So many children, so many hopes, so many tiny funerals. History often reduces those tragedies to numbers. 17 pregnancies, no surviving heir. But behind every statistic stood another nursery, prepared with hope, another cradle, another small collection of clothes carefully folded away. Even surrounded by royal ceremony, grief remained astonishingly ordinary. Visitors often noticed that and showed genuine kindness towards servants. She remembered names. She asked after illnesses. She thanked people. Simple gestures. The sort of things history books rarely celebrate. Yet perhaps they deserve celebrating more than another military parade. Empires rise. Empires fall. Kindness tends to outlast both. Elsewhere in Europe, another royal child was learning the complicated art of becoming a monarch. Inside Vienna, Archduchess Maria Theresa hurried through another lesson. She was still young, curious, bright. Her tutors filled each day with languages, religion, geography, etiquette, music, history, and enough formal instruction to leave almost any child quietly wishing for an afternoon outdoors. Royal education was wonderfully thorough and relentlessly exhausting. Imagine being 8 years old while someone explains international diplomacy before lunch, then Latin grammar after lunch, then dancing lessons, then theology. Childhood looked rather different inside palaces. Maria Theresa occasionally escaped into palace gardens whenever lessons ended, not to avoid responsibility, simply to breathe. Rain had left everything smelling wonderfully fresh. She loved those moments. The fountains, the damp flowers, the cool evening breeze. Perhaps she did not yet realize that one day those peaceful walks would become increasingly rare. History often grants its future rulers one final stretch of ordinary childhood before handing them extraordinary responsibilities. Back in Madrid, Charles II remained awake later than usual. His attendants noticed he had become quieter over the years. Not unfriendly, simply thoughtful. There is a difference. One evening he asked for old family records, large books bound in leather, page after page documenting births, marriages, deaths, titles, names repeated across generations. Philip, Maria, Charles, Margaret, Leopold, again and again and again. The family tree resembled less a tree and more a carefully tied knot. One marriage linked to another, one cousin marrying another cousin, one alliance strengthening political power, while quietly weakening future generations. No one intended harm. They believed they were protecting kingdoms. History has a gentle way of reminding us that good intentions do not always produce good outcomes. Charles slowly turned another page, another portrait, another ancestor, another carefully arranged marriage. Outside, rainwater dripped steadily from a palace roof. Inside, the fire settled into glowing orange coals. He wondered, perhaps, How different life might have been had politics allowed love a little more freedom. It is impossible to know. History offers remarkably few second chances. Let's drift toward another quiet palace. This one lies in northern Europe, where evenings arrive a little earlier and winters linger much longer. In Stockholm, candlelight reflected across polished wooden floors. King Charles XI preferred order. Everything had its proper place. Documents stacked neatly. Furniture arranged carefully. Schedules followed faithfully. His ministers occasionally joked that the king could probably organize snowfall if given sufficient authority. Only privately, of course. One generally avoided making jokes directly to monarchs. Career longevity tended to improve that way. Charles XI enjoyed routine. Morning meetings, afternoon inspections, evening reading. The predictability brought comfort, especially during long Scandinavian winters when darkness arrived before many people had quite finished thinking about lunch. Rain eventually became snow. Snow became silence. Silence became habit. Royal life adapted to every season. As night settled once more across Europe, hundreds of palace windows glowed against dark landscapes. Some rulers studied maps. Others read scripture. Some listened to music. Others simply watched fireplaces burn lower. Their crowns rested nearby. Heavy, decorated, beautiful, completely useless against loneliness. That may be one of history's quietest lessons. Power can command armies. Power can build magnificent palaces. Power can fill rooms with gold, velvet, marble, crystal, and mirrors. Yet it cannot guarantee peaceful sleep, nor perfect health, nor lasting happiness. Outside, the last light rain finally faded. Clouds slowly parted. A handful of stars appeared above ancient rooftops. The gardens shimmered beneath moonlight. Inside, servants quietly covered dying fires with fresh logs that would burn until morning. The corridors grew still. The conversations ended. Doors closed softly. Across the continent, kings, queens, princes, and princesses prepared for another night beneath enormous roofs that echoed with centuries of family history. Some dreamed of stronger kingdoms. Some worried about children. Some thought about tomorrow's council meeting. Some simply hoped to wake feeling a little healthier than they had today. The embers glowed softly. The glass reflected the stars instead of the rain. And somewhere, almost unnoticed, another generation was growing up inside those palaces. Children who would inherit not only crowns and castles, but also the quiet burdens carried by every royal family before them. Their stories, too, were already beginning. Morning arrived without fanfare. No golden sunrise spilled dramatically across palace walls. Instead, a blanket of pale clouds drifted over Europe, softening every rooftop and tower. The rain had finally moved on, but it left behind cool air and gardens still shining with tiny drops of water. The fireplaces had burned through the night. Only warm embers remained. Servants moved silently through corridors carrying fresh wood, replacing burned candles, opening shutters one careful inch at a time. They knew exactly how much noise a sleeping palace would tolerate. Too much, and someone important might complain. Too little, and someone even more important might wonder where everyone had gone. Palace life depended upon balance. A curious balance, always visible, never noticeable. Perhaps that was the greatest skill a servant could possess. To be present without appearing present. To hear everything. To remember everything. And to speak about almost none of it. Far away in Vienna, Emperor Leopold I had already begun another day. His desk looked exactly as it had yesterday. Stacks of correspondence. Wax seals. Maps carefully rolled into leather tubes. Music manuscripts resting beside official state papers. Few rulers blended art and politics quite like Leopold. One moment, he discussed military strategy. The next, he adjusted the harmony of a sacred composition. History rarely allows people such contrasting hobbies. Yet Leopold somehow managed both. He believed music reflected order. Every instrument had its place. Every voice entered at precisely the correct moment. Perhaps he wished governing an empire worked the same way. Unfortunately, human beings are considerably less predictable than violins. Ministers entered quietly. One carried reports from Hungary. Another brought financial accounts. A third arrived with diplomatic letters from France. Leopold smiled politely. There was never only one problem. Empires collected problems the way old libraries collected dust. Slowly, constantly, and always more than anyone expected. Still, he remained patient. He rarely raised his voice. Visitors often noticed something unusual about the emperor. He listened longer than he spoke. That alone made him different from many rulers. Silence can be an extraordinary political tool. People reveal surprising amounts simply because someone allowed them enough time to keep talking. Leopold understood that. Perhaps composers naturally become careful listeners. Meanwhile, in France, Versailles had already awakened. Not gradually. Spectacularly. Doors opened. Footsteps echoed. Hundreds of servants began another carefully rehearsed performance. Because Versailles was, in many ways, the world's most expensive stage. Every movement followed tradition. Every greeting carried meaning. Even standing in the correct place required knowledge that newcomers spent months trying to understand. Louis XIV had designed it that way. If nobles spent their time worrying about palace etiquette, they had less time plotting rebellion. An unexpectedly clever strategy. Instead of fighting ambitious aristocrats, simply keep them busy wondering whether they bowed correctly before breakfast. Court life could be wonderfully exhausting. One duke reportedly spent nearly an hour deciding which coat appeared respectful enough for a morning audience. Imagine devoting 60 minutes to choosing the correct embroidery. Fashion has always demanded commitment. Royal fashion simply demanded entire afternoons. Louis watched all this with quiet satisfaction. Versailles functioned exactly as he intended. Beautifully, precisely, endlessly. Yet age had begun changing his perspective. The endless ceremonies no longer thrilled him quite as they once had. Sometimes, after the formal audiences ended, he escaped into smaller rooms overlooking the gardens. There, without hundreds of eyes watching every gesture, he could simply sit. No speeches, no ministers, no elaborate performances, only silence and perhaps a cup of warm broth. Growing older has a remarkable way of making simple comfort seem increasingly luxurious. Elsewhere, Queen spent another peaceful afternoon reading beside a tall window. Outside, sunlight finally broke through clouds. The palace gardens glowed. Birds returned after the storm. For a brief moment, everything appeared lighter and appreciated quiet beauty. Unlike rulers remembered for extravagant displays, she often found happiness in ordinary moments. A letter from a trusted friend, fresh flowers, gentle conversation, the laughter of children visiting the court, although those sounds often carried bittersweet memories. Loss never truly disappeared. It simply became quieter, like distant church bells heard through morning mist, always present, never overwhelming. History sometimes celebrates dramatic victories. It should probably spend more time admiring quiet endurance, and possess plenty of that. Now, let us wander toward another castle, another family, another royal child slowly discovering what destiny expected. In Vienna, Young Maria Theresa continued her lessons. Languages first: French, Italian, Latin, German, each spoken carefully beneath the watchful eyes of tutors who believed proper pronunciation could influence international diplomacy. Perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. Royal children represented future alliances. Every word mattered. Every gesture mattered. Even handwriting mattered. Maria occasionally sighed when another grammar lesson appeared. Perfectly understandable. Children throughout history have rarely greeted homework with overwhelming enthusiasm. Some traditions never disappear. Still, she learned quickly. She possessed remarkable determination. Her tutors noticed. Her father noticed. Although neither could yet imagine how fiercely she would one day defend her inheritance. For now, she remained simply a young girl, watching birds outside classroom windows whenever lessons became especially long. Across Europe, another palace prepared for evening. Candles returned. Fireplaces crackled. Servants drew heavy curtains against the cooling air. The familiar rhythm repeated itself. Morning responsibilities gradually gave way to nighttime reflection. Charles II once again sat near the fire. His health continued its slow decline. Walking had become difficult. Eating remained uncomfortable. Speaking required effort. Yet those closest to him noticed something remarkable. He rarely complained. Not publicly. Not privately. Acceptance settled over him like a warm blanket. Perhaps he understood there were battles no king could command an army to win. The greatest struggles often happen silently, within the body, within the heart, within the mind. Outside, evening settled gently over Madrid. Church bells echoed across the city. Families gathered for supper. Merchants closed wooden shutters. Children hurried home before darkness covered narrow streets. Life beyond palace walls continued almost unchanged. Kings might influence history. Ordinary people continued living it. That quiet truth often disappears beneath crowns and ceremonies, yet it remained the foundation beneath every kingdom. As darkness deepened, Charles requested music. Again, soft voices entered from the adjoining chamber. No applause followed. No audience gathered. The music existed simply because it brought comfort. Slow, sacred harmonies drifted through warm rooms. Firelight danced across polished floors. Rain had disappeared entirely now. Only the occasional breeze touched the windows. Charles closed his eyes. For several minutes, no one spoke. Even servants paused their work. Silence filled the spaces between each note. There are moments history cannot fully record. No official document describes exactly how warm the room felt, or how the fire smelled, or how candlelight reflected in old glass. Those details disappear. Yet somehow they are precisely what make the past feel alive. Tonight, Europe seemed unusually peaceful. No storms, no celebrations, no dramatic announcements. Only quiet palaces preparing for sleep. Louis XIV reviewed tomorrow's schedule before retiring. Leopold corrected one final line of music. Queen had finished another chapter of her book. Young Maria Theresa whispered good night to her governess. Charles II watched the last glowing embers settle into gentle ash. 5 different rulers, 5 different kingdoms, one shared human experience. The day always ended. The candles always burned lower. The corridors always grew quieter. And no matter how magnificent the palace, morning would arrive again, asking each of them to carry the weight of velvet, duty, and expectation for one more day. The fire dimmed. The stars brightened above Europe. And somewhere beyond those palace walls, another child looked up at the same sky. completely unaware that one day historians would write far more about kings than about ordinary dreamers. Yet both slept beneath the same night, and both listened, perhaps, to the same quiet wind moving gently through the darkness. The nights grew longer, not suddenly, not in the dramatic way paintings often suggest, where autumn arrives in a single burst of golden leaves and poetic melancholy. Instead, the light simply lingered a little less each afternoon. The palace windows reflected darkness a little earlier. The servants lit candles a little sooner. The fireplaces burned a little longer, and almost no one mentioned it. History often moves like that, quietly, one ordinary day at a time. If you're still awake, come a little farther down these corridors. The stone beneath our feet has grown cool. The air smells faintly of oak smoke and melted beeswax. Somewhere in the distance, a clock gently marks another passing hour. There is nowhere we need to hurry. In Madrid, King Charles II sat in his favorite chair beside the hearth. The chair had become familiar to everyone in the palace. It stood beside a tall window overlooking one of the inner courtyards, where a fountain continued its slow rhythm regardless of politics, illness, or royal ceremony. Water flowed. Seasons changed. Kings came and went. The fountain seemed wonderfully unconcerned. Charles appreciated that. He had grown tired of rooms filled with anxious faces. Every visitor wanted something. Advice, permission, a signature, hope. Sometimes all he wanted was a quiet hour watching the fire. His attendants had learned this. They entered softly, placed another log on the flames, adjusted the blanket resting across his knees, then disappeared almost as silently as they had arrived. Several of them had served the king for decades. They remembered him as a young man. They remembered the optimism that had surrounded his coronation. They remembered whispered hopes that perhaps this generation would finally restore the strength of the Spanish Habsburg line. Time, unfortunately, had chosen another path. No one said it aloud. No one needed to. The palace itself seemed to understand. Portraits of ancestors lined every gallery. Each generation looked confidently toward the future. Each generation believed it was preserving the dynasty forever. And yet, here sat the final king of that ancient Spanish branch. Quiet, gentle, without an air. History can be astonishingly patient. Sometimes it spends centuries building something magnificent, only to let it fade almost without noise. Across France, Versailles remained dazzling, at least from a distance. Visitors still gasped at the gardens. Foreign ambassadors still admired endless halls of mirrors. The fountain still sparkled whenever sunlight appeared. But those who lived there every day noticed small changes. Louis XIV no longer walked quite as quickly. The long ceremonies occasionally exhausted him. Even his famous appetite had begun to fade. Age asked for small concessions first. An earlier bedtime, a lighter meal, a slower walk. Only later does one realize how many little changes have quietly accumulated. Louis rarely admitted weakness. King seldom did. Instead, he simply shortened meetings, delegated more responsibilities, spent increasing amounts of time in smaller private apartments rather than the grand ceremonial halls. These rooms were simpler, still elegant, of course. This was Versailles. Simpler remained a relative term. The chairs were upholstered in rich velvet, the fireplaces carved from marble, the curtains woven with gold thread. But compared with the glittering hall of mirrors, they felt almost intimate. Here, Louis could read, pray, reflect, or simply watch the fire burn low while rain clouds gathered beyond the gardens once again. Perhaps even the Sun King eventually learned that the brightest rooms are not always the most peaceful. Meanwhile, in Vienna, Emperor Leopold sat with his court musicians, not because duty demanded it, because he genuinely enjoyed their company. A violin quietly tested its strings. A harpsichord answered. Pages of handwritten music rested upon wooden stands. Outside, evening settled gently across the city. Leopold lifted a page and smiled. This passage, he quietly remarked, could breathe a little more, not stronger, not louder, simply more gently. It is a lovely phrase. Music should breathe. Perhaps stories should, too. The musicians nodded. No one hurried. No one raised their voice. Another version was played, better this time. Leopold closed his eyes. For a few minutes, he was not emperor, not commander, not head of a vast dynasty. Simply another listener, enjoying beautiful music beside a warm fire. There are surprisingly few moments in history when rulers are allowed to become ordinary people. Those moments are worth lingering over. Elsewhere, young Maria Theresa had begun noticing changes within herself, not dramatic ones. Simply the quiet realization that childhood was slowly ending. Her lessons had become more serious. Conversations among adults became easier to understand. Maps spread across tables no longer appear mysterious. Instead, they represented responsibilities, borders, families, promises, future decisions. She sometimes wandered the palace library after her studies. It became one of her favorite places. Thousands of books lined the shelves, leather bindings, dusty pages, the faint scent of ink and old paper. Libraries possess a special kind of silence, not empty silence, expectant silence, as though every book patiently waits for someone to continue its conversation. Maria loved that feeling. She often paused beside tall windows overlooking the gardens. Rain had returned, only lightly. Tiny drops drifted across the glass, while candlelight reflected from behind her. She wondered what sort of ruler she might become. It is a question every future monarch eventually asks. Few receive the answer they expect. Back in England, Queen Anne's court remained noticeably quieter than those across the channel. She preferred evenings without elaborate spectacle. A few trusted companions, a comfortable chair, letters from old friends. Sometimes embroidery rested in her lap, sometimes a favorite prayer book, sometimes nothing at all, simply sitting beside the fire while darkness slowly gathered outside. One evening, a young servant accidentally dropped a silver tray. The sound echoed sharply through the room. The poor girl froze, certain her career had just ended, and looked up, smiled kindly, and asked only whether anyone had been hurt. The servant shook her head. "No, your majesty." Then, and replied softly, "The tray has suffered the worst of it." The room relaxed. A few quiet smiles appeared. The tray was collected. Life continued. No punishment, no dramatic lecture, just ordinary kindness. It is such a small story, yet somehow it tells us far more about and than another official portrait ever could. As autumn slowly surrendered to early winter, Europe settled into longer evenings. The fireplaces became the true centers of palace life. Councils met nearby. Families gathered nearby. Musicians performed nearby. Children listened to stories nearby. Even kings found themselves staring into glowing embers after long days filled with responsibilities no ordinary person could quite imagine. Fire has always invited reflection, perhaps because flames never remain still. They rise, they fall, they disappear, then return again, very much like history itself. Dynasties flare brightly. They dim. Another family takes their place. Another generation believes its future will last forever. Then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, time continues walking. Tonight, as our own journey grows deeper, the corridors seem quieter than before. The portraits fade into darkness. Only candlelight remains. Only soft footsteps. Only the gentle crackling of another ancient fireplace. Charles II watches the flames. Louis XIV studies the fading evening beyond his window. Leopold listens to music and closes another book. Maria Theresa dreams of a future she cannot yet fully see. None of them know exactly how history will remember them. Perhaps that is for the best. If people knew the ending while living the story, they might never find the courage to begin. The embers settle lower. A servant quietly places one final log upon the fire. Warm light spreads gently through the room. Outside, winter waits patiently beyond the palace walls. And somewhere in the distance, another bell marks another peaceful hour that has already slipped quietly into history. By now, winter had quietly sailed across Europe, not the dramatic winter of paintings, where every rooftop is buried beneath impossible amounts of snow, and every traveler somehow looks noble despite clearly freezing. This was a quieter winter. Thin frost along palace windows, cold stone corridors, gardens sleeping beneath pale skies. The mornings arrived slowly. The evenings arrived even faster. If you have ever watched daylight fade on a cold afternoon, you already understand feeling. The world simply becomes softer. The fireplaces become more important. The conversations become quieter. And people find themselves thinking a little more than usual. Inside the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, King Charles II noticed the seasons more than he once had. When he was younger, the court calendar dictated his life. Audiences, festivals, diplomatic receptions, religious ceremonies. Everything moved according to tradition. Now, however, the weather seemed to matter just as much. Cold mornings made his joints ache. Long evenings left him tired. Even holding official meetings became increasingly difficult. His ministers tried not to notice. Or rather, they noticed very carefully while pretending not to. That was another unwritten rule of court life. Everyone saw everything. Almost no one mentioned it. A loyal servant quietly placed another cushion behind the king's back. Charles smiled gently. "Thank you." Only 2 words. Yet the servant would remember them for years. Kindness often survives longer than power. History sometimes forgets battles. People rarely forget being treated with dignity. Outside, smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys across Madrid. Ordinary families were warming bread, sharing simple meals, closing shutters against the cold. The king and his people lived remarkably different lives. Yet, tonight they all depended on exactly the same thing: a warm fire. Across the continent, Versailles continued its endless performance. Even winter could not slow the machinery of Louis XIV court. Every ceremony happened on time. Every audience followed tradition. Every noble knew precisely where to stand, or at least hoped they did. Standing in the wrong place at Versailles could accidentally become tomorrow's biggest political scandal. History has witnessed wars over territory. Versailles occasionally witnessed rivalries over chairs. Human priorities can be wonderfully unpredictable. Louis himself had become noticeably quieter, not unhappy, simply reflective. Age often replaces certainty with observation. One afternoon, he dismissed his ministers earlier than usual. Instead of another meeting, he wandered toward a gallery overlooking the gardens. Snow rested lightly upon carefully trimmed hedges. The fountain stood silent. Without flowing water, the gardens felt strangely peaceful. almost humble. It reminded Louis of something he rarely admitted aloud. Even the grandest palace depended entirely upon seasons beyond human control. Spring always returned. Winter always arrived. Not even kings negotiated with nature. He stood beside the tall windows for several minutes. No speeches, no advisors, only silence. Sometimes silence tells better stories than words. Far away in Vienna, Emperor Leopold welcomed a small gathering of musicians into a private chamber. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the evening air. Inside, candles reflected warmly against polished wood. One violin began quietly, then another joined. Soon the room filled with gentle harmony. Leopold closed his eyes. Music had become his refuge. Politics demanded certainty. Music allowed uncertainty. A melody could hesitate. A harmony could linger. No ambassador ever appreciated lingering, but composers certainly did. One young musician nervously apologized after missing a note. Leopold smiled. "It was only one note," he said softly. "We have many more." The room relaxed. Sometimes the greatest leaders lower expectations rather than raise fear. The rehearsal continued. The music became warmer. Outside, snow continued falling without the slightest concern for imperial affairs. In England, Queen Anne spent another evening reading letters beside the fire. One came from an old friend living in the countryside. The letter spoke not of politics, not of parliament, not of international alliances. Instead, it described winter apples, a new puppy, children learning to skate across a frozen pond, and smiled. Those ordinary details pleased her more than official reports, perhaps because they described life untouched by court ceremony. There is something wonderfully comforting about ordinary happiness. History often overlooks it because it lacks dramatic headlines. Yet it is precisely what most people quietly hope for. A peaceful home, friends who remember to write, a warm evening, enough food, enough laughter, enough time, and folded the letter carefully. She would read it again tomorrow. Meanwhile, in Vienna, young Maria Theresa had begun spending more time in the palace library than anywhere else. Outside, snow covered the gardens. Inside, thousands of books waited patiently. She loved biographies, especially those describing rulers from centuries before. Some had governed wisely, others less wisely. Quite a few seemed absolutely determined to create unnecessary problems for themselves. History offers no shortage of ambitious people making questionable decisions with extraordinary confidence. Maria noticed something curious. Many great rulers shared surprisingly ordinary fears. They worried about their children, their health, their reputation, their legacy. The crowns looked magnificent in portraits. The letters they left behind sounded remarkably human. She wondered whether future generations would read her own letters someday. The thought felt strange, almost impossible. History always belongs to someone else, until one day, without realizing it, it belongs to you. Back in Madrid, Charles had grown tired. The physicians visited less frequently now, not because they had solved anything, simply because there was less left to discuss. Their conversations had become familiar. Rest, warmth, prayer, hope. The king accepted each recommendation with quiet grace. One evening, he asked to have a favorite portrait moved closer to the fireplace. It showed his mother. He looked at it for a long time. The room remained completely silent. Sometimes memory speaks more gently than conversation. The servant who moved the portrait later wrote that the king's expression was peaceful, not joyful, not sorrowful, simply peaceful. There is dignity in acceptance. Charles seemed to have found it. Across Europe, winter nights grew longer still. Palaces glowed softly against dark landscapes. Travelers hurried along snowy roads. Church bells echoed through cold air. Children gathered close to fireplaces while grandparents told old stories. Kings signed official papers. Queens answered personal letters. Princes practiced etiquette. Princesses continued their lessons. Life never truly paused. It simply slowed. And slowing down has its own quiet beauty. The fires burned steadily. Candles flickered. Snow rested upon ancient rooftops. The great dynasties of Europe continued believing they would last forever. Perhaps every generation believes that. Perhaps every generation should. Otherwise, how could anyone find the courage to build anything at all? Yet somewhere beyond every palace window, time continued walking. Patiently, silently, never stopping for crowns, never pausing for empires, only moving gently forward one peaceful winter evening at a time. Tonight, the embers glow lower than before. The corridors have become quieter. Even the palace clocks seem softer. Our journey is nearing its final stretch. Soon, the last fires of these old royal houses will begin to fade, leaving behind memories, portraits, and stories that outlive the people who first lived them. But for now, there is still warmth in the hearth, still light in the windows, still another quiet evening waiting to become history. The night had become very still, not the empty silence of an abandoned place, a living silence, the kind that settles over old palaces after every candle has been trimmed, every corridor swept, every great door quietly closed for the evening. Only the fireplaces remained awake. Their orange glow stretched across polished floors, climbed gently over carved wooden chairs, and danced across portraits whose painted eyes had watched generations come and go. If you have stayed with me this far, thank you. We have wandered through rain, through winter, through long galleries and quiet libraries. We have sat beside kings who could command armies but could not command sleep. Tonight, the fire burns a little lower, and so, through the centuries, Madrid rested beneath a clear winter sky. For the first time in many evenings, no rain touched the palace windows. The stars appeared above the rooftops like tiny silver pins pressed into dark velvet. King Charles II sat beside his familiar fireplace. His blanket rested neatly across his knees. The room looked exactly as it had for countless evenings. The same carved table, the same worn prayer book, the same portrait of his mother, the same faithful servants waiting quietly nearby. Only one thing had truly changed. Time. It had continued its patient work. Charles had become noticeably thinner. Speaking required more effort now. His hands trembled slightly whenever he reached toward the warmth of the fire. Yet his eyes remained gentle. One elderly servant, who had spent nearly 30 years inside the royal household, later recalled that the king almost never allowed bitterness to enter his voice. He thanked people. He apologized when he believed he had inconvenienced someone. He listened more than he spoke. History remembered his illnesses. Those who knew him remembered his kindness. Perhaps that is the better legacy. Outside the palace walls, Madrid slept peacefully. Bakers prepared tomorrow's bread long. Before sunrise, watchmen slowly walked narrow streets, carrying lanterns. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A church bell quietly marked another passing hour. The city continued breathing. Cities always do. Kings may define an era. Ordinary people define everyday life. Tomorrow morning merchants would open their shops again. Children would chase one another through market squares. Mothers would prepare breakfast. Carpenters would return to unfinished work. Life rarely pauses simply because history is changing. It quietly continues. Hundreds of miles away, Versailles also rested. The palace that had dazzled Europe for decades now seemed almost peaceful beneath the moonlight. The Hall of Mirrors stood empty. No musicians, no ambassadors, no nobles anxiously waiting for a royal glance. Only moonlight reflecting across a silent glass. Louis XIV walked slowly through the gallery. Without the crowds, the mirrors reflected only one figure, an old king. He paused. For just a moment, he looked toward the gardens. Winter had stripped them of color. The fountains were still. The statues stood patiently beneath frost. Beautiful, silent, almost eternal. Almost. Nothing built by human hands remains unchanged forever. Not even Versailles. Louis knew that. Perhaps not with sadness. Simply with understanding. Age has a curious way of replacing ambition with perspective. When he was young, he had dreamed of greatness. Now, he seemed to appreciate peace a little more. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold finished another evening surrounded by music. The final notes drifted into silence. The musicians bowed. No one applauded. There was no need. The performance had never been intended as entertainment. It had been comfort. After everyone departed, Leopold remained alone beside the dying fire. He looked at the pages of music resting upon the stand. Ink, paper, ideas. Perhaps these melodies would outlive him. Perhaps not. History is wonderfully unpredictable. Sometimes magnificent palaces disappear. Sometimes a single piece of music survives centuries. One never truly knows what tomorrow chooses to remember. Leopold smiled softly, then carefully closed a manuscript. In England, Queen Anne sat beneath a warm wool blanket with another letter resting in her hands. She had read it twice already. Still she smiled. Outside, frost covered the gardens. Inside, the fire crackled gently. One of her ladies quietly asked whether Her Majesty wished to retire for the evening, and glanced toward the fireplace. Just a little longer. Not because she feared tomorrow, simply because the warmth felt comforting. There is something deeply human about delaying bedtime by a few peaceful minutes beside a glowing fire. Kings did it. Queens did it. And perhaps so do we. Meanwhile, young Maria Theresa stood beside the palace library window. Snow drifted slowly beyond the glass. She watched it without speaking. One day she would inherit responsibilities beyond anything she could presently imagine. Wars, negotiations, losses, victories, decisions affecting millions. Tonight, she simply watched snowflakes. Childhood still belonged to her. For a little while longer, history can wait until morning. Across Europe, countless other royal households settled into sleep. Some would become famous, others almost forgotten. Some dynasties would flourish. Others would quietly disappear into family trees and dusty archives. But tonight, all of them shared the same darkness, the same stars, the same winter sky, and perhaps the same quiet hope that tomorrow might be peaceful. The fireplaces continued burning lower. Servants quietly checked each room before retiring. Candles were gently extinguished one by one. A corridor grew dark. Then another. Then another. Eventually, only a handful of lights remained anywhere within the great palaces. It is remarkable how enormous buildings become almost ordinary once everyone has gone to sleep. The grandeur rests. The ceremony disappears. Only walls remain. Stone, wood, glass, fire. The palace becomes simply another home. As midnight slowly drifted toward dawn, a faint breeze touched the old windows. The embers glowed red for one last quiet hour. No ministers knocked at doors. No court musicians rehearsed. No ambassadors requested audiences. Europe itself seemed content to sleep. Time, however, never slept. Somewhere a child had just been born into another noble family. Somewhere an old servant had quietly finished a lifetime of work. Somewhere a young prince dreamed of becoming a great king. Somewhere an elderly queen dreamed only of seeing another peaceful sunrise. History was already preparing its next chapter. It always is. Without announcing itself. Without fanfare. Simply continuing. Our own journey is almost complete now. Only one evening remains. One final fire. One last quiet walk through these ancient halls. In the next and final part, the embers will finally fade into ash. Dawn will arrive over Europe's old palaces, and we will gently leave these kings, queens, servants, musicians, and lonely corridors exactly where history left them. Not as legends carved in marble, but as ordinary people who happen to wear extraordinary crowns. The fire grows softer. The stars begin their slow retreat. Somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, morning is already on its way. At last, morning began to arrive, not with trumpets, not with the dramatic sunrise that films so often love. Instead, the darkness simply became a little lighter. The stars quietly disappeared, one by one. The eastern sky turned from black to deep blue, then from blue to a soft silver gray. A new day had come, almost without anyone noticing. If you are still awake, thank you for walking these long palace corridors with me. And if you have drifted in and out of sleep along the way, then perhaps these old kings and queens have done exactly what they hoped to do tonight. Simply keep you company for a while. Across Madrid, the first church bell greeted the morning. Its sound floated gently through the cold air before disappearing into quiet streets. The city slowly awakened. A baker opened heavy wooden doors. The smell of fresh bread drifted into narrow alleys. A stable boy carried water to waiting horses. Merchants unlocked their shops. Children, still wrapped in blankets, slowly rubbed sleep from their eyes. Life began again, exactly as it had yesterday, exactly as it would tomorrow. Inside the royal Alcazar, servants were already awake. They moved carefully through silent corridors, replacing burned candles with fresh ones. Fireplaces received new logs. Curtains were opened. The first pale sunlight entered rooms that had spent the entire night glowing only by firelight. Everything looked different in daylight. The shadows disappeared. The portraits looked less mysterious. The corridors seemed shorter. Even the palace felt somehow smaller. Night has a curious way of making buildings appear endless. Morning gently reminds us they are simply places where people live. King Charles II sat quietly beside the same window where we first found him. The rain was gone. The glass reflected only the pale winter sky. For a long moment, he simply watched the city beyond the palace walls. No ministers, no ceremonies, no physicians, only silence. His kingdom stretched farther than his eyes could see. Across Spain, across Italy, across the Netherlands, across distant lands beyond the Atlantic Ocean. Maps described it as an empire, yet from this window, it looked like chimneys, roofs, morning smoke. Ordinary people beginning another ordinary day. History often speaks about empires. The people living inside them usually thought much more about breakfast. Charles smiled faintly. Perhaps he understood that better than most rulers. Power had surrounded him since birth. Yet peace arrived only in small moments. A warm fire, a familiar face, a quiet prayer. Morning light across old glass. Those things asked nothing from a king. Not far away, a young servant quietly entered the room carrying warm bread and broth. Charles thanked him. The servant bowed, then hesitated. He wished to say something encouraging, something memorable. Instead, he simply smiled. Sometimes kindness needs no speech. The king smiled back. History never recorded that exchange. No official document mentioned it. Yet, perhaps it happened exactly that way. History belongs not only to great events, it also belongs to gentle moments too small for anyone to write down. In Versailles, Louis XIV also watched another sunrise. The palace was already beginning its endless routine. Footsteps echoed, doors opened. Courtiers prepared for another carefully organized day. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The young king who once danced at magnificent celebrations had become an old ruler watching frost melt across his gardens. He no longer needed applause. He no longer needed constant admiration. Age had quietly taught him that the most valuable luxury was neither gold nor marble. It was stillness. For several minutes he stood entirely alone. The hall of mirrors behind him remained empty. The gardens before him remained silent. No audience witnessed the moment. Perhaps that made it even more precious. Not every beautiful scene requires spectators. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold welcomed the morning not with political meetings, but with music. A single violin quietly practiced in another room. The melody drifted through open doors. Leopold paused before beginning his work. He listened, only listened, when the music ended. He nodded to himself. Then he turned toward the day's responsibilities. Perhaps that was his greatest gift. He never allowed duty to completely silence beauty. Queen awoke early. The fire had burned down to pale gray ash. One servant quietly cleaned the hearth, while another opened curtains. Soft winter sunlight entered the room and looked toward the garden. A few birds had already begun searching for food among frozen branches. Life continued, always quietly, always patiently. She folded yesterday's letter once more and placed it carefully inside a small wooden box. Some memories deserve keeping close, not because they change history, because they change us. Elsewhere, Maria Theresa stood beneath the same morning sky. She was no longer thinking only about childhood. She had begun imagining the future, not with fear, with curiosity. The path ahead remained hidden, as every future always is. Yet she stepped toward it anyway. That, perhaps, is courage in its simplest form, not knowing what tomorrow holds, and still greeting the sunrise. As the morning spread across Europe, thousands of palace windows caught the light. The same sunlight touched castles, farmhouses, monasteries, fishing villages, mountain cottages, grand cathedrals, tiny bakeries. It made no distinction between kings and shepherds, between queens and servants, between noble blood and ordinary hands. The sun has always been wonderfully fair. Perhaps history should try to imitate it more often. The years would continue. Louis XIV would become another portrait hanging on another palace wall. Charles II's reign would quietly come to its end, bringing the Spanish Habsburg dynasty to its final chapter. Leopold's music would outlive many political arguments. Queen and will remain remembered not for conquest, but for quiet perseverance. Maria Theresa would grow into one of Europe's most remarkable rulers. New kings would inherit old crowns. New children would play in the same gardens. New servants would polish the same silver. New fires would burn inside the same fireplaces. Generation after generation, Century after century, history never truly ends. It simply changes its storytellers. And what are those grand palaces we have wandered through together? Many still stand. Their walls remain. Their gardens bloom each spring. Visitors now walk the same corridors where kings once whispered with ministers. They pause before fireplaces that have long since grown cold. They admire portraits whose subjects once worried about tomorrow, exactly as we do today. Perhaps that is history's quietest lesson. The people of the past were never truly different from us. They laughed. They worried. They grew tired. They loved their families. They feared losing those they cherished. They hoped tomorrow might be kinder than yesterday. The crowns were extraordinary. The people beneath them were not. And perhaps that makes their stories even more beautiful. Now the fire has finally gone out. Only soft gray ash remains. The rain that welcomed us at the beginning of our journey has disappeared. The glass reflects only daylight. The long corridors are filled once again with ordinary footsteps. The servants begin another day's work. The musicians tune another instrument. The bells announce another morning. Life continues, as it always has, as it always will. So, as we quietly leave these ancient halls behind, let us remember them not only as rulers wrapped in velvet and gold, but as human beings who search for warmth beside winter fires, listened to rain against old windows, and found brief moments of peace in a world that never stopped moving. Their empires faded. Their crowns passed others. Their voices fell silent. Yet their quiet evenings, their reflections beside glowing embers, and their gentle humanity still linger, like the last warmth of a fire long after the flames have disappeared. Thank you for spending this rainy journey through history with me. Now, the palace is quiet. The fire is out. The morning has arrived. And it is finally time to let these old kings, queens, and forgotten evenings drift peacefully into the pages of history. And perhaps into a peaceful night's sleep.